Hi, this is Gina Wagers, and we are going to be doing some additional training on protecting our students' data and complying with FERPA. Our training objectives are to understand the basics of FERPA, and this is to build off of our district's training on FERPA that we do annually, to learn how FERPA applies to our specific school operations, review our district's Board of Education policies, and then identify some best practices for ensuring that we are complying within our building. So to start off reviewing our broad board policies, we do have some specific language that relates to student data restrictions, and it basically just states that any student data that is maintained in any kind of data system that we're using to collect over time can only be disclosed in accordance with Student Data Privacy Acts, and that our district does comply with FERPA. In addition to this, within our board policies, we do have to provide parents and guardians annual written notice as far as their rights under FERPA. This usually takes place in our district with enrollment or re-enrollment each year, and that is a form that parents have to go through and sign digitally, and then it is kept as part of the student's file at the district level so that they understand their rights and responsibilities regarding their students' data. A few additional things here in the board policies regarding FERPA in our district. Students or parents and legal guardians are only receiving information and data that pertains solely to their student, and that student data is to be destroyed when it's no longer necessary for the purposes of that data or whatever we're sharing. Our board also specifies in the instance that there is any kind of security breach or data is unnecessarily shared, that each affected student, parent, or legal guardian of that student, if they are a minor, will be immediately notified, and then the district will conduct an investigation into the causes and the consequences of that breach until all of that can be sorted out. So when we look back at FERPA, what is FERPA? It is a federal law that's aimed at protecting students' educational records and their privacies. It ensures that parents have access to those records as well as students once they reach a specific age. It basically protects the rights of them by limiting access to those records of anyone that does not have any interest in the data or information that is pertained in those records. And so then who does FERPA apply to? So any school that receives funds from the U.S. Department of Education. It affects how we basically handle issues like school safety, access to educational data for research and accountability, and the safeguarding of student records and information. To kind of help us understand what falls under FERPA, there are different definitions for what educational records are versus what directory information would be when you're thinking of student information. So educational records are anything that directly relates to the student and they're maintained by the school, like grades, attendance records, disciplinary files, individualized plans of study for students, whether that's an IEP or 504s or SIT plans. Things that would exclude from being educational records would just be any personal notes from teachers, law enforcement records, or medical treatment records. Directory information is more of that personally identifiable information, like information that you would find in on a student in our student management system like Skyward. That would include things like name, address, phone number, etc. And again, there is an opt-out process for parents and students who don't want any of that additional personally identifiable information included or shared from the entity. So a few things to understand with how we need to go about protecting student information is understanding the ways that FERPA law is still being revised over the last few years. One such area is attendance. When we think about attendance, the definition has been amended to encompass other situations in which students are attending class but aren't necessarily present physically. So when you think about COVID or our online students, because we do have students who work online who are necessarily not on site in the physical location of our building, but those records would be examples of those. Directory information, schools are required to honor former students' opt-out requests while they were made when they were attending the school. And this is, of course, unless the student has rescinded that and they are now allowing the school to share information from when they were a student there. Another key piece of directory information is student ID numbers. Student ID numbers may be disclosed as directory information, but if a student, parent, or guardian is wishing to gain access to educational records, they cannot solely use the student's ID number to gain access to those. And then educational records, peer grading does not violate FERPA. Another key change is how we define school officials. So outside service providers can be given access to educational records if we are outsourcing a service that our district would otherwise provide using its own employees. We do have a partnership with the Pawnee, and which is a mental health service for a lot of our students, where they are coming in and they're an outside entity, but they are providing service to students on school grounds. So only those individuals or case managers from that service with legitimate interest in that individual student have access to the student's personally identifiable information, and those records are accessed under the direct control of us as the school maintaining those records. And an important thing to note here is that consent forms for school employees to communicate with these mental health service providers are required by the district. And these should be completed prior to any communication between us and those outside services by the student's IEP case manager, school psychologist, school social worker, or building administrator, because those do require a parent or guardian signature for those entities for us to talk with and share information about that student. There are a few exceptions to consent requirements. So some situations where schools can disclose information without consent might be to other school officials with legitimate educational interests. So for example, if we have a student who transfers out of our district to a neighboring school district or a district somewhere else in the state, obviously those files and records then are requested by the new district that the school is that the student is attending. And then if any of those educational advocates have specific questions about information pertained in those records, they can reach out to us and we can discuss and share information related to what is in those records. So again, like transferring records to another school would be an example. And then of course, obviously, if we are being asked to comply with judicial orders or subpoenas, that's not something that we can reasonably say no to, so we would have to comply and share information depending on what is being asked of us in those situations. Another exemption, and when we think about COVID and what was happening during that time as far as health and safety, if there are specific health and safety emergencies, that would also constitute a situation where a school could disclose information without specific consent. It is important to note here that school nurses are the designated health professionals in our educational setting, and they are also subject to FERPA because we do receive Department of Education funding because we are a public school. So school nurses can share personally identifiable information with appropriate officials, whether that's an agency in town that has something to do with health or safety emergencies that are meant to protect the health or safety of that individual student or other individuals in the school. One thing to note here, a student's illness and any of their subsequent absences from school may be disclosed without consent to other students and their parents if that information is in a non-personally identifiable form. One other thing to consider when we talk about FERPA and specific student populations within our building is how we support students in knowing and practicing their rights under FERPA as well. Because as a secondary school, when we have students that turn 18 and we're talking about those individualized plans of study and post-secondary goals, if we have a student who's transitioning from our school to a post-secondary environment, students have the added responsibility of knowing their responsibility and role in advocating for their educational needs. Parents or guardians at that point, when a student turns 18, are not going to be reaching out to educational staff for information unless they're given permission by the student. And then another specific category or group of students within our building would be our students with disabilities, students that have IEPs. IDEA changes a little bit when the student turns 18, so then they fall under Section 504 as far as their educational programs, supports, and services. So the student then again is becoming responsible for self-disclosure of their disability, providing evidence of their needs based on evaluations, obtaining their own accommodations, and then self-monitoring their effectiveness. So when we think about FERPA as it pertains to our secondary students who are looking to transition or who are soon to be turning 18, ensuring that we're supporting them and understanding their rights and responsibilities as their own advocates of their educational decisions is a very important piece of FERPA as well. So a few common missteps that we need to be aware of and be vigilant for within our specific school setting, because again, based on recent studies, a lot of higher education leaders have identified privacy as a really critical IT issue, and it's not just on the technology side, but other areas that we need to be mindful of what we're saying and how we're saying it. Verbally, we can't be discussing a student's performance in any public setting. It would be very unfortunate to be out to dinner and the table next to you is talking about and using a student's name, going over information about grades, behaviors, etc. So we need to be protecting students' rights outside of our educational setting as well. Another big one is student management systems and our parent communications, and making sure that if we are obtaining information from Skyward on students, that we are looking carefully at who does have permission to be communicated with regarding that student and their individual progress. A lot of our families are non-traditional families where we may have multiple families attached to the same student because of divorce, remarriages, maybe the student is not living with biological parents, maybe they have a guardian. So we need to be very mindful of looking at who has rights and access to that student's information in the first place, so that when we are sending or reaching out to parents or guardians for communication, that we're sharing grades and records with the proper people with proper consent. Thinking too about our physical environment at the school level, documents and their disposal is very important. So not mishandling physical copies or records of things that we have printed off, not leaving those on the printer, utilizing our building shredders in the workroom so that we are not leaving anything that does have students' personal information on it out or accessible to others that do not need that information. And then again, thinking of our learning environments, our physical spaces as well, making sure that we're not displaying student information in a classroom setting, whether that's printing out, again, demographic sheets or posting grades with student-specific identifiable information next to them. So just being mindful of the way that we're sharing that information within those settings as well. So a few compliance tips or best practices for following FERPA would be thinking about our security measures. So obviously physical locations, making sure that you're locking information and data away in cabinets that are secured. Digitally, password protection on things, using our network, working with our technology department to ensure that anything that you are having students access is also not asking them to disclose personal information on sites and things as well. And then, of course, continued training, completing our annual FERPA training through the district, and then staying up to date with any changes to FERPA that might directly impact the policies and procedures here at our building level. And just as a piece of information here, consequences for non-compliance obviously include legal and financial risks for schools because compliance agreements might need to be made if we are found to not be following FERPA. It would require us to update our policies and things like that. It does do potential harm to the student's trust, as well as the guardian or parent, as far as their privacy goes as well. And it does cause reputational damage to our building and our district. So we need to be mindful of the information we have access to and how we're sharing that and who we're sharing it with.